Okay, thank you so much. And yes, welcome back, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about the use and potential use of translation technologies for something that we are all probably already involved in, which is scholarly communication. So that includes scholarly publishing. So maybe some of you have already ventured into the world of publishing, your first article maybe, or book chapter. If you haven't already, then it's probably something that you know is coming up that you're going to need to learn more about, the publishing ecosystem. And I'm also going to take this opportunity to try and sneak in a little bit more methodology by talking to you about something called a systematic literature review. So maybe some of you have experience with that. I participated in one for the first time over this past year. So it was something new to me, and I thought, oh, maybe it's not as common in the humanities as it is in the sciences. So maybe this would be interesting for you as well to learn a little bit about a different approach to doing a literature review. So we'll have that 1-2 combination of method and content here. Okay. So it is no news to you, I'm sure, that translation has played such an important role in the transmission of knowledge over the ages, right? We have some very kind of exemplary examples here. The House of Wisdom was also known as the Grand Library of Baghdad. This was a group that was established around the 8th century and ran for about 500 years. And it was a library on the one hand, but it was also kind of like one of the earliest translation bureaus, if you like. They had about 60 translators working there. And the goal was to take scientific knowledge and to translate it into other languages so that the knowledge could be shared. And so they were working with languages like Greek and Syriac, Persian, Sanskrit, and translating, in this case, mainly into Arabic. And the topics covered many different disciplines: philosophy, math, medicine, astronomy, optics. And this was a really, really important group that tremendously helped to transmit scientific knowledge to other cultures. Following on from that, another example was the Toledo School of Translators. This one was in around the 12th and 13th centuries. Here they were taking some of this information now available in Arabic and translating it into Latin or Old Spanish. And again, covering, kind of not just literature. We often associate historical translation with literature, but this was translating scientific research on math, astronomy, chemistry into other languages. So throughout history, these are just two very kind of well-known examples because they were large organized schools, but throughout history, translation has been so important for transmitting knowledge. And now, of course, you are familiar with the idea of a scholarly journal, right? We have many examples in translation. You've probably published in some of them. If not, you've definitely read articles from some of them. The earliest scholarly journals came out in the mid-1600s. The first two came out very quickly, one after the other. The original one was in French, published in French, and the second one came out just a couple of months later in English. And if you think about it, it's quite interesting that, almost 400 years later, this is still the form of scholarly communication that we are using, that we are most familiar with. So it has an enduring kind of history as a key way of transmitting knowledge. But let's look at how knowledge is changing. We went from having those two journals in the 1600s, to having many more today. And one of the earliest attempts to sort of quantify or measure the growth of scientific literature was undertaken by a researcher from information science. His name was Derek de Sola Price. And in 1961, he published the first sort of quantitative data about how scientific knowledge could be measured through the scientific literature. And he looked at a period from 1650, so from when those first journals appeared, up until 1950. And he calculated that the number of publications about scientific research across all disciplines was growing at an average annual rate of about 5.6%, which meant that it was doubling more or less every 15 years. And he said that in 1950, there were roughly 60,000 journals that had appeared in that period since the first journals in the mid-1600s. So not all of them, of course, remain active, but we went from having 2 journals to having more than 60,000 journals having been established in that period. And so he was working in the 1960s, and he made a forecast that by the year 2000, there would probably be close to 1 million journals, even though they would not all be active. So you can see that those on the graph there, even if you can't read the details from the back of the room, you can see the trend of the line. It's going up, 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 up. We're having more knowledge is being produced, more knowledge is being disseminated through scientific articles. In 2010, another bibliometric scholar updated the work of Derek de Sala Price, so about 50 years later. And he looked at the period of 100 years between 1907 and 2007, so really our kind of contemporary period. And his findings were quite similar. The average annual growth rate, it wasn't quite as high as it had been in the early years, but it was still close to 5% and still close to doubling roughly every 15 years. And he found that in that period, there were about 24,000 active and what he described as serious journals. And he also noted that on top of that, so we've had that form of the scholarly journal and the scholarly article existing for around 400 years. But on top of that, in the past century, we have seen the addition of new types of publications. Things like conference proceedings have become more common, maybe technical reports. We're starting to see open archives. Preprint archives is a very recent addition to our collection of how we share knowledge. Websites, and he said these new forms were growing fast. So overall, what we have is a sense of just an explosion, really, of knowledge, and how are we going to share all of that knowledge, make it available to everyone. So there have been some thoughts on how we could sort of make this knowledge accessible and available to everyone around the world, because that's the goal of research, right? If you don't share the results of your research, then can you even really call it research? What's the point of research if we don't share the findings? That's why publication is that important last step in the process. Because if we just keep the knowledge to ourselves, well, kind of what was the point of doing that, right? The goal of research is to share it. It's an expectation normally of your funding body, and it's the final step in the process of research. But people have been wondering, we live in a very multilingual world, so how can we make sure that knowledge is shared with everyone? And so one of the ways that people have explored trying to make knowledge accessible to many people is through the use of a lingua franca. So in scholarly communication, there's a long tradition of using a lingua franca, which is sort of like a common language, right? In the past, this role has been played by Greek and Latin, particularly in Western cultures. Arabic has played this role, Persian, Sanskrit, and so it doesn't really matter which language is chosen. It's the idea that there's one language that is kind of picked out and used as a common language to try and ensure that people from other regions and cultures can still access that knowledge. So of course there's a very pragmatic motivation behind choosing a lingua franca, right? We say, well, anyone who learns that lingua franca can participate in the research conversation. So it's a very pragmatic motivation. And in the 19th century, for example, we saw that English and French and German were all widely used for scholarly communication, right? There were even some proposals to try and create artificial languages that would be used for this purpose. That Esperanto is probably the best known example of an artificially constructed language that could be used, that could play the role of a lingua franca. Now, of course, we are seeing that English has taken on this role of the sort of key or central language that's being used for scholarly communication. And unfortunately, though, what we've seen is that it's not being used simply as a convenience, but it has become a real pressure to publish in English. And we might even say that if you don't publish in English, you know, your work is not going to reach very many people. This has become a sort of a mantra now, that English is the language of scholarly communication. And this has taken hold really over the past 50 years, I would say, 50, 60 years. English has become embedded. We are in a little bit of a different situation in translation because our business is language and we are all multilingual, and so we don't necessarily feel this to the same extent that it might be felt in some other disciplines. But if you think about a discipline like health science or technology, there it is almost 95% of publications around the world are in English. And this is in spite of the fact that fewer than around 6% of the researchers in the world have English as their native language. So what we're seeing now is a real, more than ever before, this real domination of one language for the purpose of scholarly communication. And unfortunately, as this language has become more embedded, as English has become more embedded, it has also taken on other associations that I think were not really intended in the beginning, but have now become associated with it. So now we see that English has become the language used by international journals. And international journals are considered prestigious journals. They're considered journals that have high impact. So we now have this kind of line that if you want your research to be impactful, if you want to publish in an international venue, then you must do so in English. And if you look at these two charts I've taken, the top one comes from a scholar called Amon, who was looking at particularly publications in the social sciences. And he has shown there that English is the blue line at the top, and that is the one that has continued to sort of creep up, while the languages in the other colors are going down in terms of how many publications in social sciences are happening worldwide in different languages. At the bottom, this is another graph, and this is kind of covering all scientific disciplines, so including sciences, technology, engineering, all of those harder sciences. And here we see it looks even more stark, right? The English line is the one that has kind of really shot upwards, and publication in other languages is on a definite downward trend. Mm-hmm. So this is the situation that we're living right now, that many of you are probably living right now, that you might feel pressured, or you might choose because you think it will improve your reach or the prestige of your publications, the potential for impact. You might be thinking about publishing and doing so in English. And in principle, we've seen there's a long history of using one language for scholarly communication. And that the motivation can be, well-intentioned. But what is happening really in this scenario where we have everybody publishing in English, and that means that more than 90% of people are in fact publishing in a second or maybe third or even fourth language? There was a really interesting study, the first that I'm aware of, to try and quantify the costs, the impacts of being a non-native English speaker in science. Now, this was done by a group of evolutionary biologists, so they were primarily focusing on people in science, but I think we can expand that understanding to mean researchers, because I think it's happening in the social sciences and humanities as well. If to a slightly lesser extent, still I think it's a significant practice there. So this group, what did they discover? I love this image that they've created. They've kind of presented it as a little bit of a race between a native speaker of English in blue and non-native speaker of English in the yellowy gold color. And this is very appropriate in this post-Olympic period. We can imagine that we're going to set off on a race. So the two are starting at the starting line, equal, and for every kind of activity involved in the scholarly publication or scholarly communication process, they have identified certain hurdles. And you can tell by the height of the hurdle, right, how much harder the non-native speakers have to work. So of course we begin our research process by reading, right? We have to know what's already been said. What are other people in the field doing? So it's calculated, and this was a survey of more than 700, maybe close to 800 biologists. Yeah? And so what they discovered was that reading, really understanding a paper, can take almost twice as long for a non-native speaker. You might have to read it multiple times, having to look things up, really think, concentrate on, and can take almost twice as long. So that's before you even start writing, right? That's just the reading, what's already been done in the field. When it comes to writing, approximately 50% more time needed to write a paper. And then we see that on the track, it's almost like the non-native speakers are running a steeplechase, while the other contestants, the native speakers, are just doing the regular hurdle race, right? So there's kind of these mud puddles that the non-native speakers have to contend with on their part of the track. So they might often need to involve someone else in the process. Maybe that's someone to proofread their work or edit their work. Sometimes this might be something that they have to pay for, so there could actually be a financial cost, or maybe they just have to kind of bargain a little bit, like if you would proofread or edit my paper for me, I'll do something else for you. And so there's some extra work involved in getting a third person involved in the process. Okay. Once they've actually written their paper and submitted it, the non-native speakers are more than twice as likely to get a rejection, and that's often framed around language-based reasons, right? That the linguistic quality is insufficient, or it doesn't meet the style requirements. So it's not about the science, but it's about the language in many cases, the reason underlying the rejection. And if they are not rejected but invited to revise, then here's where we see a massive difference. The extent of revision required of non-native speakers is significantly higher. They've calculated 12 and a half times higher than the effort required at the revision stage for the non-native speakers. Because first of all, you have to interpret, I would say, the feedback that you get, and that can be easier or more difficult depending on the nature of it, and then you have to try and implement it and meet the expectations of the reviewer. Okay. So that's focusing on publication. But of course, scholarly communication is a little bit broader than publication. What we're doing right now is also a form of scholarly communication, right? We have presentations. You're all going to be doing a presentation this week, and that is also a form of scholarly communication. And so they asked about that as well. They said, okay, publications is what we focus on a lot, but in fact, doing conference presentations is another important part of our job. And they said that this is also a huge hurdle for non-native speakers. There can be a lot of anxiety around doing a presentation in a second language, and so they need almost 94% more time to prepare and to practice, right? Native speaker might practice once or twice, whereas a non-native speaker might actually be practicing 3, 4, 5 times, just hoping, trying to kind of get it right. So the presentation preparation phase is huge. And they also found really that, for me this is heartbreaking, that a third of non-native speakers often make the decision not to attend a conference because they find it to generate too much anxiety for them, that it's really just a whole aspect of academic life that they opt out of because of language reasons. Okay? Or if they do go to a conference, they might be tempted to opt for something more like a poster presentation rather than a presentation where they are giving a sort of a regular track paper style delivery. So all of these costs are associated with the choice to choose one language. It's not because it's English that it's the problem so much, but it's this choice of one language and the overall dominance that language, the dominant position, the central position that language has taken on in the context of scholarly communication. So if we want to start undoing some of these costs, we have to sort of think about how we could approach scholarly communication in a different way that would support multilingualism. Oh, and those are costs to individuals. So Amano and his team were really focusing on individual researchers and what was required from them in terms of cost and effort. But we can see that in addition to individuals, there are other types of costs, right? So for the individuals, obviously, if you're having to put more time and more energy into each publication, you probably have fewer publications than a native speaker, right? If it takes you twice as long to prepare a publication, then you might expect that you have half as many publications. And that will, in fact, have knock-on effects because maybe you're competing for a job against someone who's a native speaker and who has twice as many publications as you. So maybe that makes you look a little bit less competitive, or maybe you're not going to be awarded opportunities beyond jobs, such as an academic prize, or maybe a prestigious position like being asked to sit on an editorial board. All of these things can, we hope that people are looking at more than just number of publications, but we can't be so naive as to think that number of publications doesn't matter. Right? We also see that then there are costs for science, for research more generally. So if we look beyond the individual impact, some of this might be determining what gets studied. What do we choose as our topic? If our goal is to publish in an international journal, and that journal is publishing in English, and the editorial board of that journal seems to be made up mainly of English speakers, maybe they have certain, ideas about what's interesting for publication in their journal, right? They want a topic that's interesting for an international audience, and they might say, well, the particular biological ecosystem of Thailand is not very interesting for scholars in North America or in Europe, and so we often will see people choose their research topic a little bit strategically by what might be of interest to an international journal. And then we start to see, of course, that language doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? Language is a way of conveying culture, it's a way of structuring knowledge, and so if we are pushing everything through one particular language, in this case English, are we also pushing it through an epistemological structure that is sort of Western-based, English-based, and are we kind of running the risk? Karen Bennett is someone who's written a lot on this topic, Karen Bennett in Lisbon, about how, even yeah, just the choice of language can go beyond just language. It can really impact the sort of knowledge structure behind it. And so are we marginalizing other ways of thinking, other ways of structuring knowledge, other ways of knowing things? And of course, then this will in turn have a knock-on effect on society, right? If we are not addressing certain topics that are important in, maybe certain regions or certain local areas, we're not investigating those topics. What does that mean for that population? That population is not having research that's meaningful for their local society. If we are publishing everything in English, does this mean that it's not accessible to other actors in the research ecosystem? So policymakers who might be local and who might not. Why would they speak English, right? They might not be able to access the results of knowledge. The research participants themselves. I read a very eye-opening account of Brazilian families who had participated in research on the Zika virus when that was quite happening in Brazil, and it was quite significant, and the researchers were asking for families who had been affected to please participate in research because we don't know enough about it. We need to understand better. And there was an interview with a family member who was quite rightly outraged. She said, "My family and I have participated in this research and nobody has told us, like, what are the results of this research? They've been published in some medical journal in English. No one has shared this information with us." And she was outraged, and rightly so. Like, this can happen if we don't kind of take into account that we're not just publishing for each other. So there can be costs on many, many levels. And things have unfortunately gone quite far in this direction now, farther, I think, than ever before in history. We saw those numbers like roughly 6% of researchers are native speakers of English, and 95% of research is published in English. This is a very unbalanced situation. And people are starting to push back. And again, I think very rightly so. We are also seeing some, I think, lack of nuance in policies that are emerging, particularly around new technologies, and a real missed opportunity to start leveling the playing field here. So new AI-based tools can be used to help alleviate some of that burden that is being placed on non-native speakers. But we're seeing policies that are perhaps not very nuanced in reaction to tools like generative AI. So this is one letter from the editor of an important journal, Science. And the editorial is titled, "ChatGPT is fun, but not an author." And that's because some people were including ChatGPT as an author on their paper in an effort, I think, to be transparent about their tool use. And the reaction from the journal editors was, no, this is not acceptable. So they have updated their policy to specify that text generated by ChatGPT or any other AI tools cannot be used in the work. So this means that someone who has used either ChatGPT or neural machine translation, for example, as a sort of writing aid, as a way of helping them to produce a text in English for publication, they're being told that, no, this is not acceptable. You cannot use AI tools. And I think I'm going to try to be charitable and say the motivation behind the policy was that we don't want AI being used to generate ideas, content. But certainly, why would we exclude the use of these tools for language support? And this kind of blanket policy made by, if I could say, like the editor of this journal is an Anglophone who's probably never had to publish in another language. He's a science researcher, and maybe just didn't even think that this is how 95% of the researchers in the world have to operate. So we're seeing these blanket policies that are not nuanced enough and that are actually further, I would say, perpetuating harm in terms of linguistic privilege and marginalization. So in response to some things like this, like the study by Amano, the perhaps not nuanced enough policy decisions that were made in response to AI tools, we're starting to see a sort of grassroots movement. This is happening, and it's very noticeable, particularly in the sciences. So again, these are just some headlines saying, English may be science's native language, but it's not native to all scientists. There are talented scientists who don't speak fluent English. And we're not, the world has big problems, right? We have huge problems in our world. We have climate change. We have food insecurity. We have cancer. We still have COVID that we haven't cracked. These are massive worldwide problems, and we need all of the smart people in the world working on these problems for the good of everyone. And if we say that, if you don't speak English, then you have nothing to contribute to this problem, like that's just, everyone is a loser. And I think that's just a very bad idea. And this is sort of echoed, I think, in some of these headlines, right? And so this movement to try and decenter a little bit English from scholarly communication is starting to take hold. And some of the groups that you might like to kind of be aware of that are working in this area, one is called the Helsinki Initiative for Multilingual Scholarly Communication. If you just Google that, you'll find they have a website there, and they are really advocating for the use of other languages for knowledge dissemination and sharing. And they're trying to come up with some strategies for how that might be implemented. We saw that UNESCO published at the end of 2021 a recommendation on open science. And I was really, really pleased to see that, when we think of open science, we often think of open access, right? Making things available for free rather than putting them behind a paywall. That's our most common understanding of open science. And that's very important, of course. But they have said, there are other ways of being open, and one of them is linguistic diversity. If we want to make science open to everyone, it needs to be available in multiple languages. So I really liked their framing of open as including more than just not paywalled, but also including language diversity. We've seen another group which is called COARA, which is more about how do we assess research. So you saw some of those problems that the scholars were facing with peer review, getting a higher rejection rate. How do we, and this idea that publishing in English is somehow prestigious and that publishing in another language is somehow worth less. We want to get away from that idea, and so this is a group that's working on how to implement more fair practices in evaluating research and just simply in valuing research that is done in other languages. So those are just a few of the things that are happening. So I think there's a growing movement. I'm really happy to see it, and I feel that as translators, people who are interested in multilingualism, this is something that we should be aware of, and I think that in general we are supportive of this idea that, we can do things in more than one language, and that maybe translation can be part of the bridge that helps to disseminate knowledge to other languages. Okay. But of course, how did we end up in this situation? We ended up in this situation because multilingualism is challenging, right? We chose a single language, and as we saw in the past, it had happened in other languages. This idea of a lingua franca is an appealing solution to this very practical problem. If we all do research in our own language and we all publish research in our own language, then how do we read each other's work, right? So if I'm publishing in English, but you're publishing in Japanese and in Spanish and in Italian, and I don't speak Japanese, so do I just ignore your research, or like how can I get access to your research? So it's really a pragmatic problem, right? We ended up in this situation because multilingualism is hard, but as a group, does translation have a role to play? We've seen that historically it did, and can it continue to have a role in this situation? The problem now, as compared to the days of the House of Wisdom in the 8th century, where they had 60 translators working, now we've seen through some of those graphs I showed you just how many more publications there are. Right? This is a problem that has not scaled well. Right? It's very, very challenging. The volume of work that needs to be translated, you know, if we took just that conservative estimate that there were 24,000 active journals in 2007, and if we said maybe there's roughly 10 articles per year in each journal, and each article is maybe 6,000 words long, times 7,000 languages in the world, you know, we would need to be translating 10 trillion words a year. This has gone way beyond the capacity of 60 translators working at the House of Wisdom, right? So we are faced with a real volume issue, right? There's so much knowledge and so many languages in the world. How can we tackle this challenge of making science more multilingual? And so not only translation, but maybe translation technology might have a role to play in scholarly communication, right? Can we tackle this through or with support from technologies like machine translation or large language models? So what I'm going to present to you now is the result of a study that I participated in over this past year. It just sort of wrapped up earlier this year in the spring. And what we did was what's called a systematic review. And we were funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada through a special type of grant, which they call a knowledge synthesis grant. And it's a type of grant that's not meant to support original research, but that is meant to support research that is kind of establishing the state of a field. So the sort of like, you know, what is the current state of affairs in your particular area? So you have to pitch a project with like, this is the area that I'm going to investigate, but it's not to do new original research. It's to find out what has been done. What state are we at so that we can maybe, figure out next steps for moving forward. So the question that our group put forward was, how is machine translation, or translation technology, I guess, being used for multilingual scholarly communication in Canada, because it was funded from the Canadian government, in Canada and beyond. So we were interested in looking at, you know, what's happening in Canada and how does that compare to what's happening in other parts of the world. So really what we were interested in was this intersection point of, you know, we know that machine translation can be used for lots of different applications, but we're really interested in knowing, how does machine translation intersect with scholarly communication? So what is its potential? How are people using it? Are people using it? And if so, what are the challenges they're facing and whatnot? So that was our goal, to do a literature review of the intersection between machine translation and scholarly communication. And a systematic literature review is quite common in the sciences, particularly I would say in the health sciences, a little bit less common in the humanities and social sciences. But I would like to share this with you. It was my first time participating in a systematic review. It's a little bit different, and it might be something of interest to some of you in the future. So for the systematic review, first of all, it's usually, well, I would say not usually, it's essential to do it as part of a team, right? It's not something that is suited to an individual person doing a review. So we had a 3-person team for ours, and if I could make a recommendation, it would be really helpful to include on your team a librarian, because librarians know this stuff. This is really the field of librarianship is about searching and knowing how to construct a good search. So it would be a good idea as part of your team to include a librarian. And then, of course, you bring subject matter expertise to the table. So the first thing that we had to do was to construct a query, which basically is done using Boolean operators. So we wanted to find things at the intersection of machine translation and scholarly communication. So part of our query looked a little bit like this, where we first of all had to figure out what are all of the terms that might appear in the literature? How could people be talking about translation technology? So yes, they can call it machine translation, but they might also call it automatic translation, or maybe they're going to specify the name of a particular tool. So you have to really think about what are all the ways in the literature that people could be talking about machine translation on the one hand, and then scholarly communication on the other hand. So this is where librarians will be very, very helpful in helping you kind of figure out all of the different ways, and of course your own subject knowledge as well, that you might talk about your topics, and then you can construct it using these Boolean operators to try and focus in on articles that appear at the intersection of those fields. Then you have to think about where to look for the articles. So you've probably have some experience with bibliographic databases, or sometimes called academic databases. These are often produced by the larger publishers who will index their journals. So when we talk about indexing, we mean that the journal's metadata is included in a database, so that when you search using your key terms, you will find articles on the topic that you're looking for, right? But there are many different academic databases out there. Some of them are multidisciplinary, others are discipline specific. So again, a librarian is going to be a really helpful resource for helping you to target which databases you might like to look in. For our study, we were interested in scholarly communication kind of largely across all disciplines. So we weren't looking only at scholarly communication in the translation field or scholarly communication in biology. We wanted to see how scholars in all disciplines were using translation technologies. So we had to take quite a wide approach with the databases, and we searched in 9 different bibliographic databases. If your subject is discipline specific, you might only have to look in 1 or 2. So we looked in 9, which included Scopus and Web of Science, which are very multidisciplinary databases, the Modern Languages Association, ERIC, which focuses on education, PubMed, which is, of course, medicine and health science, Dimensions, which is a database that also captures some of the, what we would describe maybe as gray literature, so policy reports and sort of documents that are not strictly academic publications, but that may still be interesting for academic purposes, like policy documents. We also, trying to put our money where our mouth is a little bit, searched in some databases that focus on other languages. So Érudit is a French language, indexes French language publications. Redalic indexes Spanish language publications. Google Scholar is multilingual. And so I should have said that our team of researchers had people who, between us, we covered with good knowledge, English, French, Spanish, and Polish were the languages of our research team. And so we wanted to look mostly at the recent time period, right? That we weren't really interested in outdated translation technologies. So we put the start period of our research from the year when neural machine translation first kind of started to be used. So we started in 2017 so that we would capture neural machine translation and also what has come since. We had to end it in September 2023 because we had to submit our report to the funding agency by January, so we had to put an end date on it. I would have liked it to go a bit further because I think the large language models are still emerging, but you know, this was the state of the field, a snapshot of that sort of 5-6 year period. And we did our search. So the search that I showed you, that's in English, using English keywords, but we did the equivalent in French, in Spanish, and in Polish. And what this allowed was not only did we retrieve documents in those languages, but sometimes we retrieved documents in other languages because they were indexed with multilingual metadata. So an example is we found an article that was written in Portuguese, but we only found it because it was part of a bilingual journal from Brazil that was Spanish and Portuguese, and we had searched in Spanish. It had Spanish keywords and Portuguese keywords, a Spanish abstract and a Portuguese abstract. The whole article was only available in Portuguese, but the metadata had been available in Spanish as well, so we were able to capture that. So it just kind of shows you that every language that you are able to add to your search could have even further reaching impact. Right? So we didn't search in Portuguese, but we were able to retrieve a Portuguese article. Same because the indexing of the journals had been done in maybe English and another language. We were also able to capture a Bulgarian article, a Turkish article, and a Russian article. So just by having multilingual metadata, even if the whole article is not available in another language, we are still able to capture it through a search. In this case, in Spanish or English, capturing articles written in other languages. When we got articles that were in languages that were not well known to our research team, we did use machine translation to translate those full text articles so that we could do a deeper analysis on them as part of the systematic review protocol, which I will explain now. So that was the searching part. So the goal of a systematic review is right there in the name of it. It's very systematic. Right? When we do more of a narrative literature review, it's kind of a little bit subjective, what we decide to include and what we decide to exclude. The systematic review process really originated in the health sciences, where for those researchers, it was very critical not to miss anything, right? You want to make sure that if you're researching the effects of a certain drug or of a certain medical procedure, you really want to capture as many examples as possible of how it's been tested and so that you can use that knowledge to make sound decisions moving forward. In the humanities, we have sort of a more, eclectic approach where we read and we maybe consult the bibliography of the article that we've read, and that leads us to another article that we think we should read, but it's not systematic in the way that systematic is applied in the health sciences. So what happens here is that after you've identified the databases that you're going to search in and you've developed your search query, you probably end up with a very large number of hits initially. So we ended up with 875 articles that met the criteria of our search term. So 875. And then, of course, you might find that because we've looked in multiple databases, the same article could potentially be indexed in more than one database. So we had to remove the duplicates because we only want to look at each article one time. So that reduced it already to 766 articles. And then this is where it's helpful to have a larger team. We then went through a process of kind of manual screening. So we started off just by looking at the titles and the abstracts. And we read titles and abstracts of all 766 articles. And sometimes you will find like, okay, my search query pulled in something, all information retrieval has to face the challenges of recall and precision. I don't know if you've come across those terms before, but whenever you're doing any kind of search with Google, a Google search, the idea of recall is that you want to get all of the articles that are relevant, and the idea of precision is that you want to get only the articles that are relevant. So what you want is basically to eliminate the noise, the things that are not relevant, and to make sure that there's no kind of silence, that you haven't overlooked relevant things. Okay? So you want to catch all of the relevant things, ideally. But information retrieval is not perfect. So we always end up with some noise and potentially some silence. So what we're doing is we're trying to reduce the silence as much as possible and reduce the noise as much as possible. So after a manual screening, we said, okay, no, actually, I used MT as a research term, as a search term. And in the world of translation, MT really only refers to machine translation. But in other disciplines, MT could refer to other things. So we got some noisy stuff that we had to filter out. And we were also looking for, in the scholarly communication literature, one of the terms that we looked for was abstract, because that's a common type of text that we produce as part of scholarly communication. But of course, sometimes abstract is like the heading of the abstract, right? So it's just like the abstract has been labeled abstract, and so that was also producing some noise. So after we went through reading the titles and the abstracts, we realized that some of them were not relevant. We filtered out a whole bunch of stuff, and we ended up then with 160 articles. So we went from 875 down to 776. Now we're down to 160. For 160, this is where you based on the title and the abstract, you determine that this is a potentially interesting and relevant to my search, my area of investigation. And so now you have to read the full text of the article. And again, we found that there were some that were not as relevant as we thought they would be based on the abstract. So we found articles that were they were using machine translation, but for purposes other than scholarly communication. So we had to eliminate those. We found that there were some articles that had been put in a setting like a medical setting, for example, being used not by researchers, but by practitioners, by medical doctors. So we wanted to eliminate them. We found that some of those articles were really focused on language teaching, using machine translation to teach people how to write, but not necessarily for scholarly publishing. So for various reasons, and this is where you really do need a team, because this is a little bit subjective, this stage where you're deciding which articles you will filter out or exclude. So you have to come up with inclusion and exclusion criteria and then try to apply them. And it's best if you can have this done by more than one person, because it is a little bit subjective. And then you end up with a number of articles that you feel really, yes, these are exactly on the topic that I want to investigate. These are really very specifically focused on that. So we ended up with 39 after starting with like 850. But you can see that this the protocol that we followed is called PRISMA. It's a very well-known one in the world of systematic literature reviews, and it will outline for you all of the steps very, very clearly that you go through to end up from your initial search to the articles that you will actually report on in your study. So we're down to 39 articles that we would report on. So the results that I'm going to share with you now are based on our analysis of those 39 articles that met the criteria of our study. So for our 39 articles, what we then did was we developed a coding scheme, and we used in vivo to try and track the themes of our research, and we sort of qualitatively synthesized the articles, and we had 6 themes that emerged from our analysis. Before I go into the details of the themes, though, I'll share with you, we generated, in vivo allowed us to generate just a word cloud, and I thought this was quite interesting. This is a word cloud of the 100 most frequent words in the 39 articles. So we basically made a little corpus of the 39 articles that we were going to look at, and we did a frequency analysis. And the most common word was translators. Okay, that seems to make sense. But the second most common word in the whole corpus was English. So when we're talking about a topic of scholarly communication and machine translation, English is the second most frequent word that comes up in that corpus. And we had to look quite far down. You see some of the other languages. I've tried to put red arrows to show the other languages, which obviously the size of the font is reflective of how frequent the word was. So you can see that the next most common ones are quite a lot smaller than English, right? So you have Japanese, Chinese, French, German, Spanish, Italian, but in much smaller numbers. Also, remember earlier in the week we were talking about localization and FIGS and how common the FIGS languages were. The FIGS languages are featuring here again, along with Chinese and Japanese. We're not seeing languages like Estonian showing up here, or Icelandic or Welsh. So, in terms of the sort of general characteristics of the studies that we retained, so the 39 articles that we retained for a deeper analysis, we saw that there were 3 of them. Now, we judged their country of publication by the affiliation of the lead author. I know that has some limitations to it, but just as a general sort of general overview. So based on the affiliation of the lead author, we saw that 3 of the studies came from the UK, 3 came from the USA. The other 33 studies, 33 of the studies came from countries where English is not the only official language. So this is interesting because it shows that the main interest in using machine translation for scholarly communication is coming out of countries that are not English speaking, right? So in some ways it's obvious, but it's also nice to document this type of thing, right? So most of the interest in using machine translation is from countries where English is not the official language or not the only official language. Okay. 32 of the studies, 32 of the 39, were very focused on experimental research and particularly in testing and evaluating machine translation quality. So that was the goal. Is machine translation good enough for scholarly communication? And we saw that half of them were journal articles, another good chunk were conference papers, and a couple of book chapters and workshop reports thrown in there. What tools came up in these papers? Well, neural machine translation, and especially Google Translate, were in almost half of the papers. So this is the technology that was most used by scholars during the period of our study. Now, as I said, we had to end it in September 2023, sorry, and I think if we had gone even 6 months later, we would have seen a more prominent rise of the use of large language models. But for the period under study, it was neural machine translation. That was the main technology. Interestingly, in this literature, no evidence at all of combining machine translation with speech technologies, with subtitling tools. So again, the focus is really on scholarly publishing, and not so much yet have we explored the potential of these tools for scholarly communication. So helping with presentations, supporting a multilingual conference. So again, I think definitely an area where there's room to explore, and people here are interested in interpreting and ASR, speech recognition technologies. This would be also an interesting avenue of research to see how we could make these tools more integrated in a context like this, like that we're in right now, okay? But at the moment, in that period of our study, not a lot of exploration of that area. Here's, again, not a shock, but a really important thing to document, I think. Which languages and language directions are these tools being used for? So we had 39 studies, English featured in every single one of them as either the source language or the target language, but mostly as the target language. So what we're seeing is that these tools at present are being used almost to reinforce the dominance of English rather than to decenter English. So the tools work in both directions, but people are using them still to publish in English. So the technology is hopefully helping to alleviate some of those burden that we saw on the non-native English speakers, but it's not actually promoting a multilingual ecosystem yet, right? So this, I think, is an important observation, because we talk about the potential of these tools, but now we see that we can't rely only on technology. Technology will not be a savior in this context. We need to address some of the other structural problems that we have, as a community, we have set up. This idea that it's still more prestigious to publish in English, or that international is equivalent to English, or that you will get a promotion if you publish in English, or you'll get a prize if you publish in English. If we don't start tackling some of those other pieces, the technology is not going to solve the problem, right? Because the technology can already translate in both directions. We've seen that it's not necessarily equal quality for every language. We still have work to do on the technology side, but the technology itself is not enough to crack this problem of making scholarly communication multilingual. So in this particular study, English was definitely the most commonly used language, and often as the target language. I specifically looked for French as well, because this was Canadian funded and they were interested in knowing how the tools were being used for French. We saw French appearing in 20% of the studies. None of the studies looked at Canada's Indigenous languages, of which there are many. And very few overall included a less widely used language, right? So again, we're seeing that potential for these technologies to exacerbate some angles of this problem, focusing always on those, making better tools, improving the tools for that same group of languages that is already quite strong and quite central, and paying less attention to the less widely used languages. As I said, many of the studies focused on whether or not the quality of the tools were sufficient for scholarly communication, and here we got very mixed reviews. Now, interestingly, a lot of this literature did not come from the translation community, right? This literature came from the biologists who were trying to see, could they use machine translation for their needs, or from chemists, or from medical researchers. So the people who were evaluating the quality of machine translation were not necessarily using the criteria that we would use in our community. So a lot of their assessments were, I would say, a little bit anecdotal. They were kind of, like, is this working for me? Could I use this? Do I think this would be helpful? But even so, anecdotally, we heard from these researchers that the tools work better for widely used languages, so a confirmation that even in other fields this is the case. They work better between closely related languages, so the more distant the language pair that you're working with, the less likely you are to get good results. They're better for gisting purposes, so people found them most helpful maybe at that stage where they were reading the literature in another language. The machine translation was quite helpful for that. So they could take an article that had been published in English, they could translate it into their own language, and the quality was sufficient to allow them to appreciate the contents of that article. It was less useful for writing, not completely useless, but less useful for writing than for reading. They found that pre-editing is useful. In other words, they had to adapt their own writing to the capacity or the capabilities of the machine. The better that they were able to write in a kind of clear, plain language. And again, remember, we're not talking about linguists here. We're talking about chemistry researchers, physics researchers. So they're not linguists like we are, but they learned quite quickly that they have to adapt their own writing to the capabilities of the tool. Otherwise, they're not going to get the best results. And pretty unequivocally, they all decided that raw output is not sufficient for publication. So you can't, this is not a quick fix. is not just dump my text into a machine translation system and then publish it. They still have some of those mud puddles that we saw on the race course. They still have to deal with. They have to still get someone to help edit their work, help revise their work. So again, it's not a quick fix, and it's not like a one-size-fits-all solution. So what are the implications of this? What are some of the things that we can be thinking about? Again, we come back to this idea that we've been discussing last week, that we need the right data for these tools. Now, part of the reason that they may not be ideally suited at the moment for scholarly communication is that the corpora used for training at the moment contain a lot of general language. These general language texts are much easier to acquire, right? They're coming from texts that are usually in the public domain, whereas a lot of scholarly research is behind a paywall and is not part of these tools. Now, we talked last week about the sale, I guess, of our collective data to Microsoft, right? The Routledge, Taylor and Francis publisher has sold a large volume of academic data to Microsoft. So this could be changing. This could change. The potential for these tools to work with specialized language may be there in the coming years. But for the moment, general purpose tools are not sufficient for specialized content. Okay? Again, how could we help to improve this? Well, through open access. I mean, I still feel like we're getting ripped off, but it's not quite as egregious as a ripoff as the idea that Taylor and Francis is pocketing money for it. So I am now at a stage in my career where I can be less concerned about where I publish and how I publish and what it looks like, because I'm out of promotions. I'm not, it doesn't matter anymore. So I'm trying really to publish a lot more in open access, but I recognize that that's, a privilege because of the stage of career that I'm at, and it's not possible for everyone. But I do think that if we are able collectively more to publish in open access, this will also eventually improve the quality of these tools. So another implication, as I mentioned, machine translation can certainly support linguistic equity and diversity in scholarly communication, but on its own, it's not enough. We're seeing that already. The tools are being used to help people publish in English. That is what's happening right now. So we need to find other levers to pull, other ways of shifting the responsibility and the expectation that it should be non-Anglophone scholars who publish in English. We need to maybe increase awareness that if we encourage, if we all just go ahead and publish in our own language, these tools are actually well suited for helping us access the research in other languages. That's actually their strength, right? Their strength is not helping people write in a foreign language. Their strength is helping people understand a text that has been written in their second or third or fourth language. So the very strength of these tools is something that we're not capitalizing on right now, because we're still encouraging people to all publish in the same language. Really, we could be making better use of these tools by allowing people to publish in their own language, or by encouraging people. Allowing is not the right word there. Encouraging. But we do need more evidence, I would say, about the other factors in play. And that's where I was really interested to see that group that's focusing on research assessment, right? How much do we value research that's published in languages other than English? That's, for me, really almost at the heart of the problem. We need to start valuing contributions in languages other than English, and not artificially attaching that idea of prestige to English language publications. Okay? But we also need guidelines about responsible use of tools in scholarly communication, and we need more, I would say, evidence from the translation community. As I said, a lot of those papers were written by researchers who are not from translation or from linguistics, so they were trying to assess the quality of machine translation, but their idea of language quality is not necessarily the same as ours because they are not linguists. So I think there's room for more research in teams where linguists work with scholars in other disciplines to look at how these tools can be used for other disciplines. good news is that it's starting. Here are just 2 projects that are underway. One is based here in Europe. This is a research framework, I guess, that is called Operas, which is focused on open research. So their mandate is really looking at open research. But as I mentioned, now more and more people are starting to consider language diversity as a facet of openness. So the Operas project had a special interest group on multilingualism, and this group was funded led and funded, I guess, by the French participants of the project. And they have been doing some research into how machine translation can support open science. So they have been trying to develop these specialized corpora, trying to put a curated data set together and testing it. And the initial results are that it's quite promising. If you put the right data into these tools, you can get better results. So they are looking at machine translation and open science. And in Quebec, there is a similar kind of project underway, looking at how translation technologies can be used as part of a solution to support francophone researchers in Canada who are currently also not publishing in French, right? They're publishing in English, even though their native language is French. So these 2 projects are looking at how to support the use of other languages in research, and they're looking at technology as part of the solution. But I'm really happy to see that it's part of the solution and not sort of being proposed as an overall solution. One of the other things that both of those groups are looking at is whether there could be a sort of professional service, so an EU service in Europe, a Canadian service in Canada, where there are professional translators, there are tools that have been customized for scholarly communication use. There are platforms that would allow collaborations between researchers, and that these would be funded with, public money, so that it's not up to individual researchers anymore who need to go and get someone to proofread their work or edit their work, that there could be a kind of professional language service, including technology, but not only technology, that would support multilingual research in these 2 very multilingual environments, right? Yeah, so I think that is promising to me, and particularly this idea that technology is part of the solution, but it's not a perfect solution. Some other issues that I think we can be considering, particularly as you move in your career, right now you're probably looking at being kind of a contributor to a journal, like writing a journal article, publishing your own research. But at some point you might move on to being more involved in editing or on an editorial board. And some of the other things that I think we collectively need to think about, one of them is metadata. And how can we get metadata to be more multilingual? Because if we at least could provide abstracts, titles, and keywords in multiple languages, this will help with the discoverability phase. Sometimes we don't consult research that's written in other languages because we don't even find it as part of our literature search, right? If we're only doing our literature search using keywords in English, and the articles are only indexed in English, are only indexed in one language. So if something is published in Japanese or in Chinese and it's indexed only in Japanese or only in Chinese, and then we do our search in English, we don't find that research. So we need to somehow get more multilingual metadata to help with the discoverability phase. Once we discover the research, then we can get help from machine translation to access and read it. But first of all, we need to find it, right? We need to know that it's out there. So this is a key part of the puzzle, which as someone who's publishing your own research, you don't necessarily have a big say in, but people I'm looking at who are involved in editing and editorial boards, this is something to bring to your board to say, like, how can we get more multilingual metadata so that scholars searching in other languages can find our work and then machine translation can be helpful to help us read it. Other intermediary steps that I think we can take, if the journal that you are submitting to allows you to submit abstracts in multiple languages, take advantage of that. Again, this is part of the, the journal probably won't do the translation of the metadata for you, but sometimes they give you the option. It's like, you must submit an abstract in English, but we also accept abstracts in X, Y, and Z languages. If you are able to submit your work, just your abstract, not your whole text, but your abstract and your keywords in multiple languages, this again will help with discoverability. And a lot of journals now, or an increasing number, I shouldn't say a lot, but a growing number of journals are, again, not requiring, but allowing or encouraging that you submit a plain language summary along with the scientific abstract. So this doesn't replace the scientific abstract, it's alongside it, it's a plain language summary. And this again, I think, will facilitate international uptake of your research, because whether it's somebody themselves reading in their second or third language, or whether they're using machine translation to get that in their own language, a plain language summary is infinitely more comprehensible than some of these dense scientific abstracts that we produce. So again, it's not meant to replace the work that we're doing. So unfortunately, it means more work, unfortunately, but it's more work with hopefully, the goal of making your own research more discoverable to a wider number of people, and that includes people who are not accessing it in their first language. Okay. And so I will conclude this by saying the single language model for scholarly communication, again, so it happens to be English, but we would have the same problem even if the language of choice was a different one. This idea of using a single language model for scholarly communication, the cracks are really starting to show now. I don't think it was malicious intent. I think there was a sort of a pragmatic reason behind it, but it's very clear that it's not working. There are serious inequities, and so we need to find a better solution. There's a grassroots movement that's happening, but it's happening largely without input from translators. This is coming from scholars in other disciplines. And so I think we, as a community here, need to raise our visibility and be open to collaborating with these other groups. So I have started a nice collaboration with some biologists, and it's really productive and fruitful. They are very happy to have specialized input from a translator, and I'm learning about some of the challenges that they face as non-translators, right, in a multilingual world. So be open to collaboration and sort of, raise your visibility so that people know that you're willing to collaborate and be part of this conversation. A real takeaway that I have from that systematic review that I did is that at the moment, machine translation is not supporting linguistic diversity. It's sort of reinforcing the dominance of English at the moment. And so we need to be aware of that technology alone will not fix the problem. We need to look for policy support and for ways of valuing research in other languages. Okay. At the moment, machine translation seems to work better to facilitate the reading portion of research rather than the writing portion. That we can all work on developing multilingual abstracts and plain language summaries as sort of stepping stones to getting to a more multilingual ecosystem. And that we can all try to make our texts more translation friendly. This is another comment that I have for anyone who's involved in the editorial side of it. Sometimes these word limits that we put lead to dense and opaque text. In the period where we printed our publications, it made sense. It was a clear requirement that we had to have hard word limits. And we see things like, 250 word abstract. We don't tend to print as much anymore. So if you have a publication that is entirely online, it is not unreasonable to say you could have a 500-word abstract, and that will already make it a more readable abstract, right? The shorter the word limit, the more dense the writing has to be, the more kind of gymnastics you engage in to kind of cram things in. And if you can loosen the word limits, as I say, if you have a still print, it might not be possible, but if you have an online publication, just by loosening the word limits a little bit, you may get text that's more readable and more translatable. And then I'll just end by saying this, like, technology is not enough. We need to also be doing work, and as people are in this room, it's great to see, on policies, on other, on the human side of technology, because we still need technology as part of a larger system. It's not going to be the be-all and end-all solution to this challenge that we are all living. And if you would like to know more about the systematic review that I was part of, it is in the open repository, and you can access it at that link, and it kind of just expands on some of the points that I made there. Okay. I will open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Lynne. It was really interesting. I like this focus on the scholarly publication system. I don't think we're talking about that enough as academics in general. I had a question about you using the systematic review as a method, and you mentioned that it's more objective. Do you find that our discipline would benefit for implementing more of these methodologies from exact sciences, not only systematic reviews, but maybe other more data-driven methodologies in general? And where do we stand on what we bring uniquely as humanities researchers then?
Yeah, so I don't want to say that we should abandon our current methods. I think being aware of other methods is very helpful, and then we still need to carefully choose our method, whether it's for the literature review or for the research portion of our project. We need to choose the method that aligns best with the research questions that we have and with the goals that we have. I am a little bit, kind of a foot in both camps. My work is very technology-based and technology-oriented, so of course some of the work that I do might align well with the methods and approaches used in the technologies and sciences. So I don't really want to say that humanities researchers should abandon their current methods, but I do think it's helpful to be aware of other options. And yeah, I mean, I got to, at this point in my career before I did a systematic review, so clearly like it's not something that I had to be doing from day one, and it suited this particular project. It might not suit every project. So no, I think awareness is good, but we still need to bring our own critical judgment to choosing the best method for the project that we have. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting, inspiring, and I felt very I could relate to many of these situations you have described before. I have more of a recommendation than a question, and this is like visiting the museum here in Antwerp, the Plantin Moretus Museum, where you can see how multilingualism and translation has been very, very fundamental to the global circulation of knowledge in the Renaissance period. And there you can, for instance, you can see the Biblia Regia, which is a Bible, a multilingual Bible, And these are things that were used, like centuries ago, and this showed how translation was always meaningful in this area of knowledge transfer. I have a small question, though, about making our text translation friendly. And as a non-native English, dealing with publications in English, I have got sometimes comments like, "This English is shaky," and no one could say what shaky means in this context. And of course, I'm aware as a non-native, my English may have like many problems, but at the same time, I kind of tend to think that there is a very specific English which is required. And sometimes it happens to us as Latin American scholars that we do have our texts translated or proofread by translators or editors which are locals. Mm-hmm. So they are supposed to be bilingual, but they are not native English speakers. And this kind of work, which we pay for, sometimes get rejected as well.
Yeah.
So what should we do? Paying for native English speakers for editing, proofreading, or translating it's very much expensive than using your colleagues, like hiring your colleagues who have an expertise in English.
Yes, I think there's a double challenge because, as you say, it's not general language English that they're looking for. It's academic English, and it might even be discipline oriented, some of the specialized English. So finding a translator who is both a subject level expert at that level, we're operating at the highest level of knowledge in a field, can be challenging. So it's perhaps, again, requiring this double level of collaboration, that you may work with colleagues who are subject matter experts, but also with a translator. I'm not well positioned to answer this question because I am a privileged English speaker. So I don't know if there are perhaps other people in the audience might be well placed to answer that. I don't have a good answer. I recognize that it's a problem, though. Mm-hmm. And there are some people here with solutions. Jack, can you maybe pass the mic to Heidi? Sorry.
I'm not sure if Leo wants to address that.
Yeah. No. Sorry, Leo. I didn't see you. Yep.
Okay. I'll head back up. Get my steps in. I'm not sure where the question was. Peter.
It wasn't thank you for it, but it's not a question, it's an answer. I think there's a high level of normativity that you will discover if you use a word processing program like Word, or whereby Microsoft dictates to you what you should write and how you should write. And it's very often American English. Mm-hmm. And it's according to the conventions of scholarly writing in American high schools. Mm-hmm. And stop using too much passive and all of this sort of stuff. And actually, your text might be grammatically correct, but these unspoken rules of style should be explicitated by the people who are evaluating, because very often they're unaware of their own judgments.
Yes.
And that is a problem.
Yeah, so it goes to this problem of that it's not only that people are expected to write in English, but that now the pools of peer reviewers and the editorial boards of journals, there's a disproportionate representation of Anglophones on those. So they are looking for, and if they're an American-speaking Anglophone, they're looking for language that fits their model. Yeah. So that's what I mean. It's like a bigger problem than just the English language. It's that now many of our editorial boards and our peer reviewer pools have a disproportionate number of Anglophones in them. So it's a problem that we need to tackle on many levels, so diversifying those pools of people as well, yeah.
And could it also, since I have the microphone and I also have the power to dismiss everyone, could it also have something to do with formal conventions? Because as you pointed out, like, I mean, we've been using the journal form in English for many hundreds of years, and it hasn't changed all that much.
No.
Where is there an opening for machine translation and machine translation literacy to break out of those formal constraints and offer other types of multimodal, you know, forms of conveying knowledge? And there we have this project on science news translation, and we came across a small startup called sciencepod.net in Dublin, and it's they use a lot of AI stuff to do science communication. So you can you give it your journal article, and then we'll make an infographic, or we'll make a summary in multilingual, you know, summaries and so on. I'm not saying that that's good or bad or anything, but that it seems to be an added advantage of machine translation in that form, that could offer alternatives to scientific communication, that it's not just English-only scientific article.
Yes, you're right. I focused on the plain language summary, but some of these journals are also having what they describe as graphical abstracts, which is like an infographic, or video abstracts, which are like 3 minutes summary of the research. We're going to talk more on Wednesday about science communication, because that's also a skill. And people trained in research are not necessarily trained in science communication. So I like the idea that maybe it was a different group that was doing the podcast. Like, you give them your article and they create.
And part of it is AI generated. Generated by a machine.
Okay. Because there's work to do as well, which, I mean, it just feels like more work for us. But we also need to learn to do science communication as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk, Professor Bowker.